Hello! Before we get into episode 20 of What Made Star Wars Great, I just want to give a shout out and say a huge thank you to Tony Z. He was very generous and left a super thanks in my last video, so once again, thank you so much. Very much unexpected, again, very generous of you, and from me, it is very much appreciated. Thank you. Hope you enjoy the rest of the video.
May 25th, 1977 saw the release of George Lucas's Star Wars, which quickly became a surprise blockbuster hit. Often regarded as one of the greatest and most influential movies ever made, it helped change the way movies were made and captured the imagination of a generation. Star Wars quickly became a pop culture phenomenon. Over the course of this series, I will be joined by a number of Star Wars fans from across YouTube and the toy collecting community, as we take a look back at their earliest memories of Star Wars and find out what made Star Wars great.
Hello Toy Collector fans, Universal Toy Collector here, and welcome to the channel. And welcome to episode 20 of What Made Star Wars Great, the series where I get to talk to Star Wars fans from across YouTube and the toy collecting community and find out about their earliest memories of Star Wars and to basically find out what made Star Wars great. Joining me this week is Andy, also known as Delvian Seek. Hello, sir. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Stu. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thank you. Not too bad. I just want to say a massive thank you for joining us and being part of the series. It does mean a lot. Thank you. Now, before we get on to the good things about Star Wars and your memories of Star Wars, I always touch on the negative side of Star Wars. And there has been, in recent years, a lot of negativity. We know that.
Has there? I haven't noticed.
Where have you been?
I don't know. I thought everyone's been really positive about Star Wars.
I'm not going to say too much about it, but there has been some negativity. Apparently, these days, you're not a real Star Wars fan unless you like absolutely everything within the Star Wars universe, which I think is a bit ridiculous. Just wanted to get your thoughts and opinions on the negative side. You know, are some of these thoughts and opinions of other people OTT? Are some people rage baiting on YouTube to get them like the likes and subscriptions up and stuff like that? Yeah, you think that?
Yeah, I think some of them are. Some of them are definitely rage baiting, sort of like to try and sort of like get their likes and their views. But to be quite honest, I don't think it's sort of limited just to one end of the opinion spectrum. It's both ends of sort of like ways that, and I'm somewhere in the middle. And to be quite honest, I think I used to watch some of the stuff because I was interested in sort of like other people's opinions and things. But to be honest, I don't care. People sort of like aren't going to tell me sort of like what I can and can't like. It's sort of I know what I like sort of like about Star Wars, and I know what I don't like about Star Wars. And if anyone tries to tell me what I should be thinking, well, they can do one.
Well, straight to the point. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you said you're in the middle, so I would class you as a rational fan. And
yes, I think so.
Fan.
Yeah, I think I'm probably quite painfully well adjusted when it comes to sort of opinions about Star Wars. There's I love the original trilogy. I even love the prequels now. Not as much as the original trilogy. I think I was when the prequels came out, I was a little bit, I'm not sure about this, but actually it's grown on me. It's a series of films that have aged well. And I think because they were made by Lucas as well, that helps. But I kind of feel sort of like the Disney era sort of moving on has been mixed, to be fair. It has been mixed.
I'm with you. I don't think everything Disney has been bad, but you said it took a while for the prequels to sort of like grow on you and you've learned to appreciate them over a course of time and they've aged well. Do you feel the same thing will happen with the sequel trilogy?
No, absolutely not.
Again, straight to the point.
I remember when I first watched the first, I can't even remember the name of it, The Force Awakens. I remember thinking, okay, well, this wasn't awful, but it didn't feel like a sequel. It felt like a reboot. And then when The Last Jedi came out and I watched that at the cinema, I remember I went with my brother and we walked out. My brother turned to me and he just went, Star Wars is dead to me.
Wow.
And I knew I wasn't going to like that film from the beginning when they did the telephone joke, and humor's a weird thing to try and get into Star Wars. It has to feel quite natural. If you force humor into Star Wars, it's just like, nah. So I knew I
I
wasn't going
felt
to like that
embarrassed when
film.
I saw that. I felt
Yeah,
embarrassed when I was
it
watching that. I
was
was like, what is
cringe.
going on? It wasn't it just. It was.
And the Rise of Skywalker, I watched that, and it was just sort of like, okay, well, they're trying to sort of make up for sort of what they've done before, but it was just a mess. And my brother, it was, I went and saw it twice, and it's the only Star Wars film, that I've fallen asleep in the cinema watching.
Really?
I fell asleep watching that third sequel film. But Rogue One, I loved. Solo,
I
I
know. I
actually
mean, that was a
enjoyed.
decent standalone film, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, Solo got a lot of grief, and I just kind of thought that didn't deserve as much hate as what it got.
No, but I feel that a lot of that come from the fact that a lot of Star Wars fans, by that point when Solo was released, had checked out Star Wars because of what happened with The Last Jedi.
Yeah,
It was just bad timing
completely.
on their part to release
But
that after
TV
that.
shows, I think Mandalorian's been great.
Yeah.
Ahsoka it's been a bit mixed. Overall,
Yeah.
I've quite liked it, but there's been some
Yeah.
elements of it which I just kind of thought that hasn't quite sat right with me. Skeleton Crew, I enjoyed. Andor, of course. I know you didn't enjoy Skeleton Crew. I enjoyed. I
It's
know
not that I
for
didn't
some
enjoy
people,
it.
it didn't feel like Star Wars. I know.
Yeah.
I know.
It's not you've read
So-
my mind.
but it's but Kenobi, there's bits of that was all right, but overall it was just sort of like I'm not sure why you needed to do that series actually, but there were some bits I liked. Book of Boba Fett, it was all right, but it was the there was some nice ideas and there's some bad ideas in it.
Yeah.
And then they went through this whole thing where Boba Fett wasn't the character you kind of built up in your head for him to be. And then right at the end, he sort of makes all this sort of like the whole series is about is him taking over and running this sort of like this town, this city. And then it's like, yeah, this isn't for us. Yeah, we need to do something else. It's like, what was the point of the whole
Yeah. I'm glad you're not the only one who felt like that. Can you see a lot of the rational fans' frustration with what's happened with Disney Star Wars? Let's just forget the idiots, the racists and stuff like that. Let's forget the people that are okie wokie dokie, right? We'll push them to the side. We're talking about the rational fans here. Can you understand the rational fans' frustration with what's happening with Disney Star Wars?
Yeah, because I am sometimes I come across as a pessimist, but I am an optimist, and I want Star Wars to be good. I love Star Wars, so I want it sort of like to be good and have strong storylines and well written, well acted, and all these kind of things. And I will admit I've been giving it sort of like a little bit of a chance, and sort of like, I mean, it was the same that I didn't notice earlier. I didn't mention The Acolyte. I'm going to mention it now. I saw the trailer. Yeah, exactly.
You faded a bit there. You faded. Yeah.
What's that series? Not seen that one, but I saw the trailer for that one. I thought actually this could be quite good, and there were elements in it, but it wasn't good. And I said, yeah, I can understand. Sort of like it basically is a big corporation, sort of like that's taken over, sort of like Star Wars, and they're just trying to make the money from it, which they have. They've made an awful lot of money out of it from the sequels, but it's almost as though they've they're trying to develop it as a business and they're trying to expand their market, and in doing so they've kind of, people like me who went and saw Star Wars at the cinema when it first came out, it's almost as though we don't matter anymore. It feels a little bit like that, and it's sort of like, actually we're the ones who kind of made it big in the first place. We're the ones who kept it going for all of those years when there was no films out. And then actually sort of like it's and maybe that's an age thing as well, as that what's something we're going to have to deal with, is sort of like, actually it's like you don't matter anymore. So it feels a bit like that.
I mean, I think that's wrong. A lot of people have said if you go to somewhere like, say, for example, Echo Base, or you go to like Star Wars Celebration, if you take out all the people that are like sort of our generation, 40 plus age group and stuff like that, and maybe probably the people from the prequel era, you take them out of it, there's going to be no one there.
No.
You know, I mean, we're the ones that are, you know, like you say, we're the ones who've kept this going for the amount of time it's been going for. We're the ones who are buying the merchandise. You know, hardly any kids are buying these action figures from Hasbro or you know, do you know what I mean? It's all the you know, the older generation. I mean, I don't, you know, it's mental.
It's because they wanted it to go on and on and on, and they realised at some point we're probably going to step back from it, and they wanted to develop them up. And to me, it's sort of like it's all this sort of like stuff around all the different casting decisions. It's all around demographics.
What I don't get is Kathleen Kennedy. She was around at the time Star Wars was released. She's been at Lucasfilm. She's been working under the people like George Lucas, Steven Spielberg. She was there. She knows how it was and the success it had, and how the fans of our generation reacted to it at that time. How can she ever think that people were like that, people like us, are going to step back from it? Star Wars was, you know, when it was released, I mean, no one thought it was going to be popular or successful. It was. And the thing, and it was successful, and people of our generation embraced it. It was everywhere. Like I've said before, it was on your cereal packets, it was on your wallpaper, your curtains, your pajamas. We had the action figures, albeit a year later. That period of time, Star Wars was huge, and it wasn't just the you know, the kids that were into it as well. There's a lot of adults that were into it as well, and we've grown up with that, and it's been with us. How can something that meant that much to us just all of a sudden go, yeah, no, we're not interested anymore? Our generation wants Star Wars to be good.
What I mean, sort of like when we step back from it, it's sort of like is that we actually get so old.
Right.
We croak it, or we're in a nursing home or something like that. I think they're looking further into the future. I mean, I'm never going to sort of like sort of lose interest in Star Wars, because even if they never produce anything else ever again, I've still got everything else. I've still got what they've produced so far. Sort of like to go back. And actually, if they never produce anything else, I'm quite happy with that. I've got enough sort of like to watch. I have to say, one of the things that Disney, I think, have done relatively reasonably well since they took over is the animation side of things. The animation, I mean, there's been shaky starts. The Clone Wars was a shaky start, ended up being one of the best Star Wars things they've ever made. Rebels, I know people are a bit mixed, and there's some stronger episodes as it goes on, but I quite like Rebels. That Resistance show, that was probably the blip. But actually, some of the new sort of series, that Tales of the Jedi, Tales of the Empire, Tales of the Underworld, which not as good, but even that Star Wars Visions, they've been doing some really interesting work sort of like that, and I just kind of think keep that coming.
I have noticed with a lot of the Tales of the Underworld and the Tales of the Jedi and the Tales of the what is it, the Sith, or no, the dark side of the Empire, I know a lot of them have been female based episodes, but that doesn't matter because they were good, compelling stories. I enjoyed them, I really did. Season 7 of Clone Wars, that was the one and only season that Disney had done. Again, maybe the first couple of episodes weren't great, but that story arc with Ahsoka and Maul and Mandalore was absolutely incredible, and it's some of the best story writing that Disney have done. Now, what I want to ask you is like you rightfully said, a lot of the Disney stuff hasn't been bad. There's been a lot of good stuff, but there's also been a lot of bad stuff. Where do you think, or why do you think there's such a lack in consistency, and whose would you say would be at fault for that, and the finger of blame should be pointed to?
Well, ultimately, it comes down to whoever's in charge, and that would be Kathleen Kennedy. I don't know Kathleen Kennedy. It was interesting what you were saying before about her, though, where she's sort of like she's worked at Lucasfilm for years. I mean, I don't know too much about sort of like Hollywood insider sort of like knowledge. But there
Well,
was
she's
talk.
been executive producer to a lot of films and stuff like
She
that. It's
has,
amazing when you
but
see.
apparently she wasn't very good. She's just very well
Right.
connected. And sometimes,
Right.
as you well know, sometimes it doesn't matter what you know, it's who you know.
Yeah.
So it could be a situation like that. But
True.
ultimately, it's her decision. She sort of like she passes sort of like decisions on things, or she employs people who make decisions around things. So
Yeah.
she makes the decisions. Um, but some of it I think is sort of like is down to people not respecting the source material, but then it doesn't hold true for everything. So because like Tony Gilroy wasn't really into Star Wars or didn't really follow sort of like
Yeah.
wasn't like a huge Star Wars fan, and he produced Andor and sort of like helped produce Rogue One.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So,
but then you've
although
got
he.
Leslie. Sorry, go
Oh
on.
God, yeah. Go on. No, no, no. Please, I want to hear this.
But then you've got Leslie Headland, who's sort of
Yeah.
like actually she doesn't, she said she didn't know anything, or she made out she did sort of like know all this stuff. She looked as I think some of the interviews she's saying she's done all this research,
Yeah.
and
Right. Yeah.
it was just such a waste of money. One of the things that annoys me the most, apart from the bad acting, bad casting, the bad sets, sort of like just bad everything,
Yeah.
is how they managed
You
to
didn't enjoy it then? Is what
waste.
you're saying?
There was bits of it. There was one episode where there's a stranger comes in and kills all the Jedi, and it
Yeah.
had like a
Well.
horror vibe. And I thought, if
Yeah.
only you'd done the whole series with the vibe focusing on the Sith, people would have been happier.
Well,
Because
that's what it was sold as. I thought that's what we were going
that's
to be getting.
exactly
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what they sold it as, and it's the bits that with Manny Jacinto. I thought
Yeah.
he was actually quite good. He was one of the
Yeah.
best things about it. But the rest
Yeah.
of it, I mean, they Jedi Master Trinity. There was really badly underused in that show, and then Jedi Wookiee was sort of like you barely sort of like saw that character in action.
Yeah.
It's sort of like all these things people really wanted to see, but no, we got the story about the twins, which made no sense whatsoever.
Yeah. I do know
So
Jedi Master Wiki's name, but I don't want to say it because it sounds like I'm a big fan. I'm not.
it's
But
Cal
look,
Naka.
listen. Yeah, all right. I know. Yeah, yeah. But listen, I didn't hear any of the rumblings going on before it came out. I just thought, wow, you know, we're going to be exploring an era of Star Wars that we haven't explored before, and the potential for that could be absolutely outstanding. But it was very, very poorly executed, in my opinion.
Yeah, I
To
agree.
boast about the amount of money that they spent on it, and then to turn around and say, well, it was the fans that, you know, the racists and stuff like that. Get over yourselves. It was nothing to do. I mean, yes, there's racist people, but a majority of the fans didn't enjoy it. And it's as simple as that. I
Yeah.
thought to get someone in like Leslie Headland, I mean, who had openly admitted that she got people in that didn't know anything about Star Wars and just wanted them to give a why? Why is that okay? That's like me. No, that's like me going into a job I know nothing about and then expecting people to jump at my beck and call and say, but you're going to get questioned. In real life, you would get questioned, why are you making that decision? Well, yeah, just because you've got to know something about what you're talking about or what you're doing. At least she had no idea. She wasn't a fan.
See, there's different angles of looking at it, though, because I mean, if the rumours are true, Kathleen Kennedy stepping down and Carrie Beck and what's his face, Dave Filoni. I was going to go for cowboy hat because that's his signature. They're going to take over, but there's part of me that kind of thinks actually you need more than just sort of like knowledge about Star Wars. You need sort of like, say, for example, he'd only ever made animation before The Mandalorian, and Jon Favreau had to basically sort of like take him through sort of like making live action, and he's doing sort of like the film now. But there's more to than just sort of like understanding the lore. It's a business at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So.
But I mean, I don't mind Dave Filoni, and I know there's a lot of like people like think, oh, they're not too sure about him. But I think, I mean, because he did Mandalorian season 3 as well, and I think Kathleen Kennedy had a lot of input in that season. Because how can you go from season 1 and 2? I mean, the ending to season 2 was absolutely, again, absolutely brilliant. It's what people wanted, you know. And I was so excited for A, season 3, and for B, you know, the Book of Boba Fett as well. We saw that little snippet at the end there, which I was like, wow, this could be great. Again,
Good.
a wasted opportunity, and the potential there for every single Star Wars project that they've done. I just think they haven't lived up to expectations. I really don't think they have, and whether that's a fan issue or not, I don't know.
Can I ask you a question?
You
So,
can.
say for example, we lived in a world where George Lucas didn't sell Star Wars or Lucasfilm to Disney,
Yeah.
and he'd gone on producing stuff, and he went on and produced the exact same content that we got now. Would it have still been acceptable sort of like
No,
content?
I don't think it would
Because
have been.
I think there's like a chain of thought. I think it's because it was created by George Lucas that there's a certain credibility to it. Even if it's bad, it's like it was created by the visionary
But
himself,
look,
as it were.
look at the backlash he got over the prequels at the time when they first came out. He
But
didn't
that's
escape them. He got sort
he
of like
didn't.
lambasted for some of that stuff.
He
Jar
did.
Jar Binks,
But
you know.
people, I think, were much more tolerant of the prequels than they are of the sequels because George Lucas made them.
Yes,
So,
because I mean, he wasn't the greatest director in the world, but
no,
he could tell a story. He had a vision. He knew what he wanted, and it was all. I mean, I know some
it
people say, "Well,
changed.
the original trilogy wasn't mapped out and planned that way." But they're the three films we got with the original trilogy.
It kind of was though, but it changed a lot. Sort of like, and
Yeah,
I think that happens with projects. It's sort of like as you
yeah,
go through
yeah.
any project, not just a film. It's sort of like what you planned, sort of like to do at the beginning. What you end
Yeah,
up doing sometimes is
yeah,
quite
yeah,
different, and there's a whole different sort of like reasons for
yeah,
it. But but he did have sort of like have an overall story thread for it, and he
yeah.
did have a story thread for the sequels as well. But they basically said, "Oh, thank you very much," but yeah, no, we're not going to do that.
Yeah. Well, again, people are saying that what his story was going to be about was the midichlorians and all that sort of stuff, and you know the
Mm,
force and stuff. I mean, I'm only kind of what I've heard. I don't know how true that is, but the issue for me with the sequels, they were so disjointed. They really were. You had two. Well, at the time it was three different directors because Colin Trevorrow was supposed to
yeah.
do the Rise of Skywalker. So you had J.J. Abrams come in. He's done The Force Awakens, which again wasn't the worst of films. It wasn't the greatest of films. Like you said, it was pretty much a rehash of Star Wars. And then you had Rian Johnson, and I, I mean, some people say it was probably the best constructed Star Wars movie.
I wouldn't.
I know, but
I
then
think
again, that's the beauty
visually,
of this series. You can have an opinion. It doesn't make it right or wrong. It's just an opinion. You don't have to agree with everybody.
no, that's very true, but I am right. Sorry, but no, I think visually, last year there's some scenes in Last Jedi where it looks
Yeah,
absolutely
the
fantastic.
cinematography was good in that film.
But as a director, he chose to take that story and sort of like all those things you set up in sort of like the first film. I want to go off in a different direction,
Yeah.
and there's no way to tell a it's like 3-act structure, sort of like it in a film in itself, and it's like the trilogy of films is supposed to be like that 3-act structure. Well, it's almost as though he did the second act for a completely different trilogy of films.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
and of course, it didn't make sense. It just
no,
didn't make sense.
and it showed in the films as well
Yeah.
because you had Rian Johnson sort of like what's the word, taking the mick out of J.J. Abrams by saying, "Oh right," because Kylo Ren turned around and said, "Oh, forget the past,
Oh,
kill it if you
hang on.
have to."
Throwing the lights at her.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. But like Kylo Ren, forget the past, kill it if you have to. To me, that was a message to the original trilogy fans saying, "Well, forget what everything that's happened in the past. Just forget that. We're going off in this direction." And then in Rise of Skywalker, you had Poe Dameron's line saying, "Oh, something about the holdo maneuver. Oh no, that was just a one-off sort of thing." So that to me sounded like J.J. Abrams was taking a dig at Rian Johnson for doing what he did. Do you know what I mean?
This is how it doesn't make sense. That holdo maneuver thing. And so I know we're getting into the granular detail of things, so I might not want to do that. It's a once in a million thing. And then at the end, over Endor, there's like a ship that's been broken up for someone doing another holdo maneuver on a Star Destroyer, sort of like, and it's all like broken up. It's just like I don't want to swear, sort of like on your video, but it's horse shit. It's sort of like a lot of the sequels, so it
I mean, for me,
doesn't
when you said
make
you were going to
sense.
swear, I thought you were going to say it was fucking horseshit, but that's
Oh,
fine. You know,
no.
it's cool. It's okay. It doesn't make sense. And look, listen, there are people out there that do like the sequel trilogy, and you know, they say it's the Star Wars for the younger generation. I get that. I get that. You know, I respect that, but it doesn't mean to say I've got to like it, and it doesn't make me any less of a fan because I don't like it.
No, I mean, fair dues. If people like it, I'm not going to sort of like just rain on their parade and sort of like
No, no,
say,
no.
"Oh, there's something wrong with you for liking it." But I also expect that back in return. So if they want to have their opinions about how much they like it, great. But I'm going to have my opinions about how much I don't like
Yeah.
it. So don't have a go at me just for having my opinion as well.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered the sort of negative side. No doubt we'll pop back into it in a bit, but let's carry on with the decent stuff. What were your earliest memories of Star Wars?
Going to see Star Wars at the cinema and
Yeah.
the build up to it, because I didn't see it immediately, but because it took a while. The prints, I mean, back in those days, it was the old celluloid prints, and there was only so many of them, and it would take a
Yeah.
while to go to your hometown, and
Yeah.
it was a big thing. There was like a little parade of stormtroopers, sort of like in the town, and
Wow.
it's like local paper and stuff like that. Um, so I think I was about 4 when I first sort of like, and it was one of my first going to the cinema as well.
Wow. You
So, which
remember
is
that
lovely.
then? Gee,
Yeah,
see,
yeah,
I
it's
have no,
absolutely
I mean,
great.
I think I was too young. I think I might have been a year younger, but so,
Yeah,
so
whatever,
had you, I
Stu.
mean, at that age, at that age, did you understand the hoo-ha going on? Because I mean, I think in the UK it was released after it had been released in the US.
Yeah,
So,
I think, yeah.
was you aware of how big this movie was? Being at that age, you didn't really.
I think it was one of those films that sort of like everyone wanted to watch it.
Yeah,
I vaguely remember it sort of like it was the film to watch because it was
yeah,
so different.
yeah,
And I know sort of like and last week Matt was saying sort of like in the States it was a very sort of odd time. It was sort of like politically
yeah,
upheaval
yeah,
and the
yeah,
Vietnam War ending. I mean, over
yeah,
in the UK, I don't remember too much about it, but it was not a great time over in the UK. There was sort of like power cuts and sort of strikes, and it it was fun though. Star Wars, it was
yeah,
so
yeah,
different. There was
yeah,
nothing else like it really. Sort of like at the time,
yeah.
it was, and I mean, I know people look back on the original cuts of Star Wars now, and it's just sort of like, oh god, that hasn't held up well. But at the time, it was brilliant. It was just
It
that
was
first,
groundbreaking, wasn't
the
it? Yeah,
first sort of the first shot of the ship sort of like coming over. It's sort of like it just blew my little mind away.
yeah, yeah,
And I was hooked from that moment on.
yeah. I mean, so what was you feeling at that time when you saw that ship go over, then Vader bursting through the door, coming through the door with the stormtroopers? I mean,
So I don't remember sort of like
oh,
every
okay,
single bit, but I remember
yeah,
sort of like key scenes. I remember the beginning. I remember the music. So sort of like
yeah,
from the film as well. Um, but it was exciting. And to me, that is what Star Wars is about. It's a
yeah,
fun, exciting adventure,
yeah,
and in
yeah,
particular, the first film, Star Wars, not New
yeah.
Hope. It's it's so well cut and edited, and there's something happening every few minutes
Marsha
in that
Lucas.
film, and it built. Yes, exactly. And apparently, she did save that film, but yeah. Um, but it was well cut, and
Yeah,
there was a lot of sort of. I remember watching an interview with Alec Guinness, and he was saying he helped George Lucas rejig parts of the script because, like you say, he wasn't great at writing dialogue,
yeah, yeah,
and Alec Guinness was just like actually he helped George Lucas sort of like just reword sort of like certain things so it flowed a bit better. Um, he did very well at Star Wars. He got a certain percentage. He never
he
had to
did,
do
didn't he?
sort of
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
he basically got to whatever film he wanted to do after that film.
yeah,
But no, it it was just fun. It was this pure escapism, and I think at the
yeah,
time it's sort of like as a young child, it was everything. I'd never seen anything like
yeah,
that before. I mean, bear in mind the things I still had on telly at that time was the old Buster Crab, Flash Gordon. which you probably
Wow.
don't remember at
No.
all. But they're like literally black and white Flash Gordon. You can see the spaceships on strings all jiggling about as it's going on, and it's like a firecracker going off in the back for like a
Yeah.
thruster. It's
Wow.
just Google it, but Buster Crab Flash Gordon, and it's sort of
Yeah.
like, and those were the sorts of things that was still on telly when I was a kid, and then that came along, and it was just like, wow,
Just
there's
a
no
different
going
world, isn't it? I
back.
mean, you
Yeah,
know, it changed the way movies were made for sure. But you know, you said it was an exciting movie, and I don't think the music gets talked about enough. Because you said you remember the music. I mean, that opening scene with the music was exciting in itself, wasn't it? I mean, what a great fanfare that is to start a movie.
yeah,
Do you know
and
what I
it
mean? It's just
I
brilliant.
mean, we can go off on a whole. We could probably spend a whole hour just talking about John Williams.
Yeah, yeah,
But I mean, I mean, I know Lucas sort of like he wanted. A lot of people were telling Lucas because he was in with sort of Ford Coppola and sort of like people like
yeah,
that at the time, saying, and a lot of people were doing sort of like modern music with their
yeah.
films, like Midnight Cowboy and stuff like that. But he's like, no, I'm going to have a sort of like a classical type score, film score. Um,
Oh,
and John Williams, he has some great themes and motives for sort of like all the different
he's just a
sort of
genius.
characters,
Yeah,
and he weaves it sort of like all in. And some of it is just sort of like some really basic sort of like melodies and notes,
yeah,
but the arrangements that he does it is excellent. It's
yeah.
and I think I loved it, loved listening to it when I was a child, and as an adult, I appreciate sort of like the intricacies and the beauty of it. Actually,
Yeah.
it's stunning
As a young
pieces of
kid, did
work.
you find yourself humming the tune to Star
Yes,
Wars a lot? Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
because it's that catchy tune, isn't it? You know, so yeah,
it's.
awesome.
I remember having the disco, the Mecha Disco
Yeah, yeah,
Star Wars
I
album.
remember that. Yeah,
Cringe.
yeah, that was different. That was different. So 1977, Star Wars was released. 3 years later, they were going to release The Empire Strikes Back. So, what were your thoughts and expectations for the second Star Wars movie?
Well, I remember at the time you just didn't know what to expect
Yeah,
because and it was sort of the first one was so great. It was just like actually how are they gonna
top
beat
list.
this one?
Yeah,
How are they
yeah,
gonna top it? And I mean, I don't remember seeing a trailer for The Empire Strikes Back. I knew when it was coming out, and I also know when they played The Empire Strikes Back at our local cinema, they did a double feature. So they played the
oh
first Star Wars film
wow,
and then
yeah,
The Empire
second,
Strikes Back,
oh wow,
which was great actually.
yeah,
Because bear in mind, it took a while for films to go onto TV or come out in
yeah,
on
it did,
video.
yeah, you had to wait,
So
yeah,
that when you went to the cinema to watch it, that was it. It's sort of
yeah,
like unless
yeah,
you knew someone who had a pirate copy, but
yeah, I
I,
didn't. I cut that
yeah,
out, yeah,
yeah, and it was. So it was that was the only way you could sort of get to it until it came on telly and then you recorded it. And
yeah,
I used to have my TV recorded sort of like Star Wars sort of like for years, but it was I did enjoy The Empire Strikes Back. I loved the Hoth battle, and
yeah,
um I see this is where I'm not going to be deeply popular with a lot of people, but
that's
Empire is
fine.
not my favorite of the
Again,
original
that's absolutely
trilogy.
fine. That's
In
absolutely
fact,
fine.
it's not second, it's third.
Wow,
So yeah,
wow.
so
Okay,
and I
no,
do
that's
like it.
fine.
There's a lot of emotional resonance in it, and
Yeah,
there's some
yeah,
really good character development. And actually, it's an excellent film. I
yeah.
still love it, um, but it's probably of the ones that I rewatch. It's probably the one that rewatch the least.
Wow,
So
wow. I mean, I, you know, but for me, it's my favorite film of the lot. I just loved what oh crikey, I can't remember his name now. Who directed it?
Irvin Kershner.
Irving Kershner. I loved what he did. I loved listening to him when he was talking about it because he's initially turned it down. He said he didn't want to do it, and
Mm.
his agent was like, "What is Star Wars is Star Wars? How can you top that?" So, and then he's going to say that he wanted to have a love story in there, but he didn't want it to be a smushy love film. He wanted like some funny moments in there, but he didn't want it to be comedy. And I think he absolutely nailed it out the park. Yes, it was dark, and it was, you know, for me, one of the greatest movie reveals ever. I Am Your Father. I mean, can you
Hmm.
imagine trying to keep that secret this day and age with all the the leaks and everything that get out, how they've managed to keep that under lock and key, testament to them. I thought it was brilliant. The sets were a lot bigger. I thought Vader was cool. The Hoth scene was superb.
Yoda
Lando,
introduces Yoda.
Yeah.
And Yoda is one of the most iconic Star Wars characters. And it can be tricky introducing new characters into sort of like established sort of like.
Well, especially a puppet.
They know, exactly. It's a Muppet. It's a puppet.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, but actually, they nailed it. They nailed it.
And a lot of people say that the acting was cheesy and the dialogue was cheesy. Yes, it was. It was cheesy, but you can forgive that because the actors, although they didn't at the time think the writing was much cop and they didn't think the film was going to be any good, their sincerity and their belief in how they delivered their lines really did make everybody believe that. Well, it made me believe what they were saying. So if I've believed it, that's because of them. So can you imagine, if Mark Hamill didn't do such a great job acting with a puppet for that amount of time, it could have just looked absolutely stupid. But because I think he was so sincere in what he was doing with his acting, he might not be the greatest actor in the world, but he believed in what he was doing, whether he believed it or not. It come across as he did, and he made that character Yoda very believable. And that's a lot of credit to Mark Hamill there. Bit of a dick now with what he says and comes out with, but other than that, he did all right in that scene or that film.
I don't know. I don't listen to a lot of stuff.
Don't. So after The Empire Strikes Back ended on a very dark note, Han Solo had been flown off to Jabba the Hutt. Was he going to survive? No one knew. We had to wait 3 years. Return of the Jedi comes out. What were your thoughts and expectations on that?
Now, I did see the trailer for sort of like for Return of the Jedi, and I think when I saw the trailer, it may have been called Revenge of the Jedi, but I'm not 100% certain about that.
Yeah.
But I couldn't wait, and I remember being confused at the time, thinking, "It's a Death Star. Is this footage from the first film?" It didn't twig. But I mean, I love Return of the Jedi. I mean, and it goes back to why I like one of the things I love about Star Wars, and it's that sense of adventure. And the film is broken up. It's that the first part is it's all set in Jabba's palace, and the whole scene in the palace and the Sarlacc bit. It's brilliant. It's just fun. It's like loads of aliens and sort of like a big sort of like slug gangster and rancors and
Underworld.
It's brilliant. It's absolutely, and the whole team sort of like coming together, it's one of the things I like about Star Wars is that it is about family, but it's about found family. So they work very well as a unit, as a team. And I know we said we're done with the negative stuff, but that's something that they didn't nail in the sequels, and it was a big mistake not bringing the original sort of like cast back together in the sequels. But enough said about that. But it was great. Ewoks, I didn't mind at the time because I was a kid. So, and I'm still of the age where it was a bit sort of okay. And I know he wanted to do Wookiees, but it wouldn't have quite worked. A, for cost, and B, because the Wookiees wouldn't have been a primitive culture because Chewbacca was great at engineering and stuff like that. It just wouldn't work. But do you know what? Actually, it's kind of like I don't really have that much of a problem sort of like with the Ewoks and everything. It is. And it is supposed to be sort of like, overwhelming odds against sort of like the underdog, and they sort of rise to the. I mean, that's the message of it. It is.
Yeah, definitely. I see. I don't dislike Return of the Jedi. I think it's a decent. I love the original trilogies. I personally feel that Gary Kurtz was missed from Return of the Jedi. That's just my personal opinion. I thought he was instrumental in Star Wars and The Empire Strikes Back. There obviously something went on between him and George Lucas, because Kurtz was with George Lucas when he did American Graffiti, so they kind of graduated together and stuff like that. And so I don't know what the main story or why they sort of like he was not part of it, but I think he was very much missed. So after Return of the sorry, go on.
But it's much more balanced, and actually they introduced a lot of characters which actually before then you hadn't really seen, although you kind of saw, and that was the Emperor. And the Emperor was excellent. I mean, an excellent bit of casting with Ian McDiarmid or whatever his
Yeah,
name is.
Ian
Um,
McDermott, is it?
yeah, Ian McDiarmid being very young and then playing him again at the age he should have been when he was older in the
Yeah, yeah,
prequels. I mean, that was brilliant. Actually, I mean,
yeah,
he was a good actor in that. And sometimes, like you were saying earlier about the bad, maybe sort of ropey acting from sort of like some of the cast, they made up for it because they actually got some good actors in that kind of offset it, like
yeah,
Alec Guinness, Peter Cushing, and sort of like some of the
yeah,
other actors.
yeah,
But Return of the Jedi, I like, you know, you got Admiral Akbar, the Battle of Endor, and stuff like it's just like it's brilliant.
yeah.
It's brilliant. I love
No, it
it.
is. It's a great film. I mean, I love, like I say, I love all three of the original trilogy. So that was it. Return of the Jedi. No Star Wars for what seemed an absolute eternity. The 90s come around. You get to the late 90s. We find out that there's going to be an episode 1. Expectations, thoughts
Now,
on the prequel trilogy in total? Because we could sit and talk all day about all the 3 movies. But I've got other
now,
questions.
before we get to the prequel trilogy, though, because you say there's no Star Wars, but there was.
Well, yeah. Well, I don't include the Caravan of Courage in the Ewok movies and the
I'm
droids
not talking
casting,
about those.
the
I mean,
expanded universe books.
well, I didn't read all the expanded universe books. I read, so I remember starting reading them, and then it started to go off in a direction. I just kind of thought, yeah, no, I'm not going to read that. But the Thrawn trilogy. I remember when the
Yeah,
Thrawn trilogy came out. That was just like, oh wow! And there was also some games as well. So there was like Shadows of the Empire game. I remember when I had an N64, I played on that
yeah.
game, and I managed to sort of like that's one of the few games that I managed to beat all the way through.
Oh wow.
So there was some stuff that was sort of like
Yeah,
that. But then when we heard that the prequels were coming out, it was like excellent, excellent.
yeah.
Sorry, I'll stay on track. Don't worry.
No, it's
Um,
fine.
uh, but I was looking forward to it. I was really looking forward to it, and um, was I a little bit disappointed when the first sort of like prequel came out? Yeah, probably a little bit.
Yeah.
But it was, but like I say, over time, I've kind of warmed sort of like to the
So,
prequels a lot more. But
so what was
I
it that
think
you were
it's just,
disappointed about then? What was it that disappointed you with the Phantom Menace?
I mean, I don't want to sort of like just pin it all on Jar Jar, but
It was
it
Jar
was
Jar, wasn't
it it just started in it was there was quite a bit of Jar Jar, but in hindsight, a lot of me realised
it?
actually that film wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at sort of like another generation, and I know some people that watched it and they absolutely love that character as sort of like as a
Yeah,
child and everything. So that's by the by. But I almost feel with the prequels, they perhaps should have started at the beginning where they started with episode 2 almost, or there was a lot of sort of like introduction and sort of like things that didn't quite go anywhere sort of like in some ways, and I kind of feel actually if they just sort of moved it along. And I also didn't get the age difference between Anakin and Padme. It was just sort of
yeah,
like it was just a bit odd. It just didn't there was a bit of stuff that still didn't make sense. But having said that, when they re-released, I was quite lucky in the cinema nearby. They did all the films. They released all
yeah,
the Star Wars films apart from Solo at the cinema again. And I remember watching the prequels again, and in particular the Phantom Menace. And I'm just thinking, actually, I really enjoyed watching it at the cinema. It was a
yeah,
visual sort of like delight to watch, and actually all those minor little criticisms in my head of that a very picky sort of Star Wars fan just kind of
yeah,
went out the window a little bit.
yeah.
I mean, the pod racing scene alone, and then
Brilliant.
the
Yeah.
duel with Darth Maul at the end and everything. It's
You
sort of
know,
like
I
it
always
makes up
say
for it.
I always say Star Wars, the original trilogy had a lot of wow moments, a lot of wow moments. For me, the Phantom Menace had the wow moment when that that hangar door opened up. You saw Maul
Yeah,
there. He took his robe off. He got that lightsaber, out, and it was a double-bladed lightsaber.
yeah,
I was like, oh wow! And the music again, John Williams and his score absolutely nailed that film. That
he
Duel of
did.
Fate, absolutely incredible. I love listening to that. Look, I got a newfound appreciation of the prequels basically because of the Clone Wars animated
Yeah,
series. You get so much depth in story with the character arcs. You find out more about Count Dooku. You learn more about
Savage, not Savage Press, what's her name? Asajj Ventress, you know,
Sarge
introduced a new
Ventress.
character. You find out about the clones. They're not just, you know, clones, they're actual people with names and stuff like that. And I thought that was brilliant. The backstories they had and the detail that went into those story arcs. I think, you know, like you say, an absolute gem of an animated series. It really was.
Mm.
But I think for me, the issue is a lot of the prequels were kind of like too reliant on CGI. That's the one good thing I will say about the sequels is the fact that they went back to the old way of filming things like sets and stuff like that.
Now, you see, for me, I think they reacted too far in that direction.
Right.
Because actually I quite like I didn't have an issue with CGI in the prequels.
Yeah.
They're tonally and sort of visually they're a very different style of film from the
Yeah.
original trilogy, and I think they picked up on the sort of like the criticism of CGI. And I agree, it's sort of like too much CGI. It might as well just be a cartoon.
Yeah.
But actually, they didn't rely on it almost enough. Sort of like in the sequels, it sort of like there wasn't enough decent CGI. When George Lucas sort of like redid sort of like the original trilogy and added
Yeah.
did his special editions, it always made me laugh because he added in sort of like a new dance number in Jabba's palace. And sort of like various bit, and Ian McDiarmid and the Emperor sort of like singing and this that, and I was kind of, why didn't you redo the Battle of Endor? I mean, you redid sort of like and Star Wars,
Yeah.
Yavin, and there's so much stuff you could have done on sort of like on Endor with sort of
Yeah.
like some of the
Yeah.
special effects, like Rogue One, sort of like that, and just didn't do it, and you just kind of think, well, that was a bit of a waste, really. I was
Yeah.
disappointed by that when he did
Because
that.
in Return of the Jedi, you know, as great a film it is, you can still see some of the blocking they
You
used,
can,
can't you,
yeah,
for the CGI back then. Moving on,
yeah.
what was it about Star Wars that really stood out for you?
I think, like I was saying earlier, around sort of like the sense of adventure. I just like the way that it looked. It looked a very lived-in universe. It felt
Yeah.
very believable. So, and I always kind of feel sort of like, even with something as far-fetched as science fiction, you've
Yeah.
got to have that suspending disbelief. So the fact that that doesn't look real, or sort of like it always looked in a sort of like a very lived-in universe,
Yeah.
and I kind of feel like the characterizations. There's a lot of I used this phrase the other day, collective archetypes, like the wise old man, and sort of like a lot of things that he's pulled from sort of like different literature and sort of
Yeah.
like history
Yeah.
and sort of
Yeah.
culture over the years, which just kind of clicks and resonates sort
Yeah.
of like in my mind at least.
Mm.
And like I say, it's around family, it's around sacrifice as well, sort of like some of the
Yeah.
key themes in Star
Yeah.
Wars. And that's carried through sort of like into Andor. Sort
Yeah.
of like I think that's one of the reasons why it resonated so well, because tonally, and I know people say it's very different, and yeah, it is, but tonally, it's quite similar, sort of
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
to the original trilogy. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you said it yourself there. It was a lived-in universe, so the vehicles look used and dirty. The sets and the buildings look used and dirty. You know, maybe Hasbro could kind of like take a look and give us weathered vehicles and play sets. Saves me having to teabag them, doesn't it? So
I've got. I I had to. I mean, I had to do a wash on my Moss Eisley set, but I think
yeah,
they did that because of the retro collection. I think they.
you think so?
I don't know. There's a little part. I know it's probably just sort of them trying to save a bit of money, but really, how much is it to cost them to throw some muddy water
If
all
it's,
over sort
you
of
know,
like their
it's supposed to
product?
be a premium line. It's supposed to be the best 3 3/4 inch line out there. You know, for the
Mm.
collectors. You know, we're not talking about Hasbro. Let's move on. How important is story to you within the Star Wars universe?
In as much that it needs to make sense, sort of like in terms of what's happening, there
Yeah,
needs to be that natural progression, and it is quite important, sort of to a degree. And this is just me, sort of like my opinion. But I still like pew pew battles and sort of like things like that, which there needs to sort of be story elements to it. But at the same time. I suppose that's sort of like that family sort of like element, sort of like within Star Wars. That's kind of the main crux of a lot of the
Yeah,
story, and the found family sort of like elements. Um, so it's important, and it needs to make sense. It needs to be coherent,
yeah,
but it's just fun. It's a bit of adventure for me, really.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, the prequel trilogy, it had its story. Was it perfect? No, but it had a point A and a point B, and in between, you had a kind of like a cohesive story between point A and point B. It got to where it wanted to get to, which was the fall of Anakin Skywalker, you
Yeah,
know, to the dark side. You then had the original trilogy. Again, you had starting point A to starting point B, where you had this farm boy, and his journey started when he met up with Obi-Wan Kenobi or Ben Kenobi, and point B was the bit where we found out that Vader was his father, and there was a redemption. So it was like a redemption arc and stuff like that. It was
yeah.
like a hero's journey with Luke Skywalker. So again, it was a coherent storyline, in
If
my
you kind of
opinion.
think, sorry to interrupt you here, I
No, not at all.
apologise for that.
No, no, no.
But all three of the main characters went through sort of like their own journeys as characters.
Yeah, yeah,
So Luke started off as sort of like naive farm boy
yeah, yeah,
who sort of like goes through a series of shocks and obstacles and actually
yeah.
comes out stronger, sort of
And
like
Jedi
at the other
training.
end,
Yeah,
and Jedi training. Yeah.
yeah,
And actually sort of like learns to control
yeah,
his legacy as well as his own sense. Leia, sort of like she's very switched on and on the ball. But she's got lots of intelligence, but she doesn't really have that much emotional intelligence in some ways. And actually,
yeah,
sort of like she part of her arc is sort of like is I'm not saying softening up, but their relationship with Han, and they work quite well together actually because
yeah,
Han doesn't care about anything, sort of like in the beginning, but he learns to care. Sort of
yeah,
like about stuff and actually get involved. He doesn't want to get involved in the rebellion, but by the end he's a general and he's
yeah.
sort of like he's fighting sort of like for the same thing, and so I liked that character progression sort of like with those main characters, which they then completely disregarded and sort of like threw out the window for the sequels.
They did, and that's why for me, Star Wars is important. Not Star Wars, bloody hell. Story is important because with that you get well written characters, you get a decent story arc, you get character development. For me, that was all pretty much missing within the the sequel trilogy.
I mean, I agree, but at the end of the day, I kind of think it's a fun adventure. So don't overplot it, don't overthink it.
Well,
Just
Star Wars is a
focus on
simple
having
story, isn't
fun.
it?
It is. It's a morality
It is.
tale.
Yeah, of course it
Yeah.
is. It is. It
So
is.
it's like don't try and make it into something it's not. Just sort of like
Yeah,
just have some fun.
yeah, yeah.
Don't forget to
Absolutely.
have fun.
So basically, what you're saying is we, as Star Wars fans, are taking it far too seriously.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure we are actually. I think maybe some of the writers, Leslie
Yeah.
Headland, maybe.
Oh, well, I wouldn't even call her a writer, to be honest with you. Talking of fans, how important do you think the older generation of Star Wars fans are to the Star Wars franchise? I know we touched on this a little bit earlier. That our generation, Andy.
We were here when it started. We
Yeah,
were we were here in the dark times, and we're still here.
absolutely.
So,
Yeah,
and by
yeah,
the dark times, I mean sort of like where there was nothing happening other
yeah,
than sort of like
yeah,
fan fiction, essentially. Um, and we're still here, and so I do think they're important, and
yeah,
I actually kind of feel we're in lots of ways we're the backbone of sort of like the fans of this particular
yeah.
franchise that sort of like keep it going. Um, but but nothing ever lasts forever. So and
Star Wars will
actually,
always last forever in my heart. The original
it will
trilogy,
always
and
last
probably the
forever
sequel.
anyway. But actually, there is a little part of me that kind of thinks, actually, there needs to be sort of like more people sort of like being interested in it, and I think everyone's sort of like a lot, most Star Wars fans are particularly welcoming and opening, and they're not sort of like
Yeah.
gatekeepers, sort of like, oh no, if you think this, you're not a true Star Wars fan, this, that, or the other, because that just shuts people, that just drives people away.
Well, of
So
course it does. Of course it does. And it doesn't help when you get the studios like Lucasfilm and Disney coming out and attacking fans, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. But I can see
the need to bring in a new generation of fans, I get that. Everything needs to be, sort of like progressing. I get that, but not at the expense of the older generation fans, because we're the ones that have kept it going. I mean, do you feel that this generation of fans, when they get to our age, like their 40s and their 50s and stuff like that, do you think they're going to give two hoots about Star Wars with the sequel trilogy? Is it going to be as well received then as what the original trilogy is still now? Or do you think that's just going to be it?
I honestly don't know. I have a feeling they'll probably be more interested in just trying to keep a roof over their heads. To be quite honest, when they get to our age,
more important things to worry about, I
and
guess.
they might have more important stuff at different times. But
Yeah,
I don't know, to be quite honest. Maybe, or maybe they'll be more interested in other things. They might be more interested in Harry Potter. They might be more interested in Lord of the Rings. I mean, I know a lot of people who are younger than me. They're not interested in Star Wars, but they love Harry Potter. They love Lord of the Rings, and Lord of the Rings is an older franchise than Star Wars.
Yeah.
So it's
Weird, isn't it?
it's weird what people get into.
Do you feel our generation of fans, though, had such high expectations because of just how good the original Star Wars was? I mean, the bar was set very high in lots of ways, musical score wise, the cinematography, the special effects. Like you said, we'd never seen anything like it before. The classical music as a movie score wasn't heard of. It was all modern music at that time. So do you think our expectations have been set so high that anything else that has come after the original trilogy is not quite been there to that level?
Quite possibly. I mean, there might be a little bit of that in terms of sort of maybe there's an exercise our generation needs to do in managing our expectations in terms of sort of how good, because nothing's really going to sort of is going to measure up to it. But then we also need to consider when we watched the original trilogy when it first came out, what else was there? The sort of like in terms of sort of like entertainment, there wasn't a great deal else out there, to be quite honest, and that's part of the reason why I think Star Wars is a big success. If Star Wars hadn't been released then and came out now,
no, I don't think it would be.
Probably not.
Would it? No,
probably not.
But then you don't know that, because if,
I don't.
like I said, at that time, Star Wars changed everything. It changed the way movies were made. Then since Star Wars, you've had like a lot of spin-offs, and not spin-offs, but you've had like a lot of movies that have tried to copy that kind of feel of Star Wars. So if it hadn't have been released, what would we have known?
Something
would
else.
We have had films like The Terminator? Would we have had films like
Possibly
Alien?
not. The other thing about Star Wars, it wasn't just sort of like tonally, it's sort of like the production methods as well. George Lucas created a lot of ways. It wasn't there when he was trying to make the film, so he created processes, he created companies and industries.
He built his own like cameras and stuff, didn't he?
Industrial light and magic sort of like came from having to make these films, and sort of like and just sparked off as sort of like a separate company, and revolutionized the way that they did sort of like special effects in movies.
I guess if it wasn't George Lucas, it would have been someone else.
Maybe might have been Spielberg. But Spielberg, I mean, it's actually, I mean, people sort of like always associate sort of Indiana Jones with Spielberg, but actually Lucas was just as involved in Indiana Jones
and Kathleen Kennedy.
Yeah, well, maybe she just fetched the coffees. Who can say?
Possibly. Who knows? Who knows?
She was quite. I think she might have been an intern on that. I don't know.
Did you know that George Lucas actually wanted Steven Spielberg to direct Return of the Jedi?
I think I may have heard that somewhere.
He wanted him to, but he wasn't allowed because George Lucas had quit the Directors Guild after being fined a lot of money for the Empire Strikes Back because of the credits. So because Spielberg was still part of the Directors Guild, he wasn't allowed to direct the movie.
That sounds about right.
Weird. Yeah.
I'm not sure Spielberg would have done a good job of it, though, to be quite honest. I actually quite like the film that we've got. I mean, sure, he would have done a good job of it, but it would be a very different movie.
Richard Marquand, apparently, I think from what I've heard, it was a bit out of his depth sort of thing. So George Lucas kind of stepped in every now and again. He was constantly there and stuff like that and saying this, and this, and this, and then this needs to be done and blah, blah, blah. Do you think that George Lucas would have done that? I mean, because I don't think he did it so much with Irving Kershner, but do you think he would have done that with Steven Spielberg?
Probably because he did it with Indiana Jones. I mean, they were, but I think they had a much stronger work. I mean, they were friends. They got on with each
Yeah,
other, and
yeah,
they had a different working relationship.
yeah.
So
No,
the
fair.
dynamic would have been
Yeah,
different. But he probably would have still got involved. It was his baby.
yeah,
So
true, true. How important are strong female characters within Star Wars?
they're
Because I
just
mean,
as
we've not had
important.
many of them, have we, to be honest with you, according to Disney
I
and
think they're
Lucasfilm.
just as important as strong Wookiee characters in Star Wars, or sort of like any other sort of like characters
Yeah,
in Star Wars. There've been some good sort of like female characters in Star Wars in my eyes. Leia being the obvious one, sort of like
yeah,
right from the very beginning.
yeah, yeah,
I quite like Jyn Erso's sort of like character actually. I like Ahsoka.
yeah. She was good.
I like Sarge Ventress.
Yeah,
I there is part of me that sort of like was just say, actually, I mean, actually, we've now got Andor, so that's good. But there was a lot of strong female characters in Andor as
yeah,
well.
absolutely,
I mean, it's
absolutely.
not something that I kind of think that's a problem for me, or I kind of think there needs to be more, there needs to be less. It is what it is, to be quite honest.
I mean,
And actually, if the character's well written and it's sort of
that's all
there's
we're
and
asking for.
there's only one female character that I think in the Disney era that I just kind of think, why did they do that? And that's Phasma. Phasma started off as
Oh,
being quite an
yeah,
interesting
wow.
character,
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
the Last Jedi, they just sort of killed her off. And I
yeah,
just kind of think I was actually more annoyed at them killing off Phasma than I was at them killing off Snoke in the Last
yeah.
Jedi. So I thought
I
she
mean,
could have been quite an interesting character
I remember
moving.
seeing her in the trailer to The Force Awakens, and I was like, oh wow, how cool. I mean, and as a character, as like a figure, she looks absolutely fantastic. But as a character and the lack of character development and arc, it was just
But
what
I
the
did actually read sort of like some of the pre-story. I mean, sort of like, and actually, it's a really interesting story. And her armor is actually apparently made out of the Emperor's ship. It's sort of like there's some interesting sort of which they could have
yeah,
explored a lot more, but they
yeah.
didn't.
No,
Um,
well,
but you could say the same around sort of like Finn's character in the sequels. All he did is just run around for 3 films shouting "Ray." It's sort of
listen, that guy has proper pissed me off. I mean, the fans were disappointed by the fact that his character was kind of dumbed down in the second one, and then, like you say, by the third film, all his lines was Ray and stuff like that. He had so much potential, which started off not. I mean, he was he defected from the First Order, so he was a stormtrooper.
yeah,
They could have built on that, but he was just a janitor or something like that, or a
yeah.
cleaner. But they just dumbed him down, and yet he's turned around and said all those things about the Star Wars fans again, attacking them, saying Star Wars is whitest and we don't like, black heroes. What a load of poppycock. But we couldn't mention that we had Lando. We couldn't mention that we had what's his name? Samuel L. Jackson's Mace Windu.
Mm.
We weren't allowed to say that. We couldn't say that because that was just like sprinkling chocolate chips in cookie dough. Do you know what I mean? According to him, absolute nonsense. We were gutted for you, mate. We were, you had the posters of Finn with the lightsaber and stuff like that. We just thought this guy's going to be awesome. Awesome. It was the writers that let you down, and Disney were the ones who shrunk your image on your poster to go to China. So how can we be racist and nutter? He's gone down
To be honest, though, I mean, it's sort of like a lot of this sort of like culture wars sort of like stuff. I mean, I try not to take too much attention to it
No,
anyway,
I know.
because I'm not really, I don't really think it's that much of a thing, to be quite honest. Or I think it's being elevated into something that is quite not for me, at least, anyway.
No,
And to me, it's sort of like there's an interesting sort of like debate around representation and sort of like young children sort of like watching the series being able to identify with certain characters. I had someone I used to work with, and I went out for lunch with her one day, and she bought a Finn figure, and I said, "Oh, I didn't know sort of like your son was into Star Wars," and she went, "He is. Should he like Star Wars?" And she said, "It's one of the few figures that I will actually buy," she said, "because he's a black character, and her son was black." And she sort of said, "I want him sort of like to be able to identify or have figures that he can identify with a little bit, sort of like more, which I know sort of like some people might not agree with, but I just kind of think, okay, fair do. Just people have different opinions about things, and it's sort of like my opinion
Yeah,
is
no,
not more valid than
that
anyone
we need to
else's.
identify with absolutely every single character in every
No,
single movie.
but from the perspective of a small child, sort of like just sort of like perhaps sort of like getting in and watching something, it, for her anyway, it was important. So
No, okay,
I kind of
no,
think there's different
yeah, fair enough,
perspectives on things.
fair enough, fair enough.
So
But listen, when fans are arguing amongst themselves when it comes to inclusivity and that kind of thing, and equality and all that sort of stuff, and inclusion, I get that. That's fans that we're just like debating amongst ourselves, sort of thing. But when an actual actor comes out and says the stuff that he says and attacks the fans, I don't think that's right, because I don't think he had any justification at all to come out and say that, in my opinion. I mean, it's not fact, it's just an opinion. Like I say, a lot of the fans were disappointed with how that character progressed,
yeah,
or or digressed, or digressed, or whatever the word is. But
regressed,
what?
regressed.
Regressed. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's not our fault. We don't write these films. We don't write these scripts. It's the writers. It's like a lot of the writers that were for the Acolyte. Why are the fans getting attacked for that? We didn't
I don't
write
know.
it.
No, I know, and sort of my kind of theory on it is, I mean, because I remember hearing about him, and I think the woman who was in Kenobi, and I think some of the one of the actors or actresses from the Acolyte as well. I mean, I remember reading something about it, and I just thought, okay, and then I'm just not giving it any fuel. Sort of like I just kind of think, I just, okay, that's your opinion, but I don't agree with that.
Yeah,
It's sort of
yeah,
like the reason, sort of like why I didn't like sort of that character in Kenobi was because it didn't make sense, and it was not particularly sort of like brilliant. Acted okay, but the sort of like the
yeah,
story, it just didn't make sense. And in the Acolyte, it's the same with that. It just did, a lot of those things just didn't make sense. It's sort of like,
yeah.
it was just,
No,
why
no,
has this been
no.
sort of thrown in there? So a lot of this sort of like other thing, I just kind of think it's just around saying it's all these other things. It's just attention grabbing, and I just kind of
Yeah,
think the way to deal with attention is just to don't give it attention.
yeah.
So
True, true. I mean, we kind of briefly touched on it, but how is important for Star Wars to? How important is it? Should I say is for crying out loud? How important is it for Star Wars to be inclusive? Is what I'm trying to say.
um, I don't. I think it's sort of like, I think it's important for the franchise, or in itself, sort of like to be open. It's not so much sort of like, I think perhaps being inclusive, but just sort of not putting people away, not turning people away, sort of like from it
Yeah,
actively,
yeah,
sort of like. Um, if the story's good and sort of like the setup's good and sort of then people will like it. It's sort of like, sometimes, I mean, it's like that example I used sort of like earlier. Sometimes it's representation can be sort of quite helpful, but it's not essential, sort of like
yeah,
to some things. And personally, I think the reason why Disney have done it for a lot of this stuff is because they just wanted to break into different markets. I mean, I think analysis of Rogue One, they sort of like some of the casting they do is because they wanted to move into sort of like some of the Asian market, and it's the same around sort of like South American sort of like markets. And a lot of people sort of sign it sort of like for sort of some kind of political sort of thing, but I
yeah.
think
But
it's just down. I think it's just down to money.
I can't understand. Well, stop. Just look. Listen. Star Wars, the original trilogy. It it was big around the world.
It was.
It,
I know. I know. So I. I
before.
think what I'm saying is sort of like, actually, I'm trying to say something because you've asked the question, but
Yeah.
actually,
Okay.
I don't really have an opinion about it, to be quite
That's
honest.
fair enough. That's fair enough.
So, because it's just, it's not something that kind of registers, that I just kind of think, oh yeah, actually, I've got a really
Well,
strong opinion about this. It's like,
no,
I
that's
don't.
fair enough. That's fair enough. That's fair enough. I've got one more question to ask you, but I'm going to chuck in another one.
No, okay.
Was Star Wars broken after
the prequels? Did Star Wars need fixing?
I don't know if it's necessarily broken, because all the stuff that had gone before was still there. So actually, if you didn't enjoy the sequels, and I know I've heard a lot of people sort of say, actually, no, six films is just canon for me. There weren't any other films in my head canon.
Yeah.
I think it wounded sort of like Star Wars, the prequels, if I'm being honest, the sequels rather. But yeah, I think actually what they've gone on to do, sort of like with some of the stuff in TV, I think is sort of like really hasn't helped.
Yeah.
I mean, they were given the golden goose, and they just kind of squandered a lot of sort of like what they had, sort of like, to be quite honest. And there is part of me now that is just sort of kind of thinking, I'm not sure if they can really come back to it, sort of like to what it was. And when you think about all the hype when the sequels were about to come out, I mean, they still made tons of money because it was sort of hyped up, and they just seem to have squandered all of that sort of like that goodwill. Maybe they will. Hopefully they will. Like I say earlier, I'm the optimist, so maybe they will.
Last question ish. Overall, what makes Star Wars great?
Because I'm going to steal Des T's line and say because it's Star Wars. It's just I think it's very difficult sort of like to pin down one single element, because like the sort of like the acting cast, it's an ensemble piece, but it's not just sort of like the story. It's not just sort of like the familiar characters. It's not just sort of like the world building that goes in it. It's not just the music. It's a combination of all those things, and it just works. It's the recipe sort of like for it, all the different combinations of all those different elements. It just worked for me. And sometimes if you don't write down that like everything that's gone into that recipe, or actually really understand it, it's very difficult to recreate the same
and that's probably
thing.
where that's going wrong this day and age, because they're not getting they're not getting the recipe right, are they? They're not getting all those elements that made Star Wars great in the first place. Andor came very close, but I think for me it was missing sort of like a certain element of what made, like the original trilogy. But do you ever think that we will see anything like Star Wars again, the original trilogy? Will there be a franchise that will have a big an effect on a future generation as what we had with Star Wars? Or do you think it was a one-off lightning in a bottle?
I'll never say never, but I think the way that people consume media and entertainment is changing. So I mean, the way that sort of like a lot of younger people sort of like consume media, a lot of them watch it on their bloody phones or sort of like their devices. Cinema isn't as popular as it once was. So who can say? Who can say? But no, I mean, bear in mind, when Star Wars came out, there was cinema, there was different types of entertainment, but actually, like in the UK, there was only like what, 3 channels. I mean, Channel 4 hadn't even come out by that point. Now it's hundreds of channels. There's streaming, there's all different ways, sort of like the audience is completely fragmented, sort of like now, and everyone's sort of like into different things. So I'm not sure something can capture the imagination of sort of like a nation or the world in the same way again. But what do I know?
True. Who knows? Here's to hoping. Andy, that has come to the end of the conversation. I've got to say, I've thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you. Loved listening to your opinions and stuff like that. Thank you very much. Where can people find you on social media?
I do have an Instagram account at Delvian Seek, and at the same name on YouTube. Cool. If you feel inclined to pay me a visit, thank you very much.
What I shall do is leave your social media links in the description below. Once again, a huge thank you. I really do appreciate you taking the time out to do this.
That was Andy, also known as Delvian Seek. Just want to thank you for watching or listening. If you stayed to the end, very much appreciated. Take care, stay safe, and we shall see you in the next video. Bye for now.
See you later.